Okay, I recognize you, Skumbuzo. I recognize you, Temba. And who else?
I'm here.
I saw a hand. Okay, I recognize you, Mr. Memela. And I recognize you, Nosipo. Oh, I recognize you, Nanakule.
In what order?
And is Simniki.
Which order?
Oh, okay. All right. Skumbuzo and then Tsotsi. And then Memela. Sorry.
Okay.
So please state your name again.
Oh, I'm Skumbuzo Makandula. Interested to ask Akona and Candice a question around what are the conversations, because we were talking about you as an archivist to come in, then there's a negotiation between yourself and the photographer, in this case of Thato Mogotsi, right? Then you also mentioned something about the displacement, or rather other bodies, other individuals that are vested in. The reason why I'm asking this is because it's the kind of a conversations us as black artists, whether you're a visual artist, whether you're a photographer, sculptor, thinking about the notion of an archive. Because I'm asking this because what happens when the artist dies? What happens to the archive? I'm thinking about Gladys Mgulandlu, I'm thinking about Unati Sikenu, I'm thinking about Utabeso Siskhala. But also what happens then when an artist dies in kind of a, what is the conversation that we are having? Because it's one thing to talk about the archive, but also what happens to it is another story. Also the ownership of this, especially as us black young artists who works with galleries, right? What is the conversation around that? But also because I think there's something that we don't talk about also when you talk about, because for me when you see, when the artist dies and then you see their body coming up in these commercial spaces, or even not, right? Who has the ownership to this archive? But also then, because I'm also thinking then, are there family trusts that are put in place to protect this kind of archive, the body of work, because the way that it gets to circulate, what is there actually to be able to speak and protect it, this archive? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, my name is Temba, and I have a question. I think it's for the entire panel, but I'm not sure, and it's like question, comment, statement. It's like, I think we can all agree that the archive is a social construction. And my question is, I guess based on that, is it, when the photograph enters the archive, what something gets neglected or downplayed? Is it the realism that the artist seeks to articulate, or is it the sense of the photograph as art? That's my one question. That's also for, I'm sorry, lady Akona. Could you also speak about Santo Mofokeng and like how he articulates aesthetic? And I also understand most of his work wasn't kind of like, you know, like activist based and like politically, like with a political point of view. Can you speak about also like how he articulated his own aesthetic? Because I think that's important, because he was working during apartheid, and he's like a African figure or a black man who has a strong aesthetic voice. You also explain that voice.
Okay, then the last in the sound is Mr. Memela.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much to the panel. I found your presentations very insightful and articulate, and but they left me with a mixed feeling because, of course, it's a very complex and complicated subject that you're dealing with. Let me start off by putting it to the house that we need to acknowledge that we live in a supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist culture. All of us, black and white. And unfortunately, my experience as a black arts journalist was that the prerequisite for you to advance, to get ahead, is that you must turn yourself into an instrument of the system, right? You must turn yourself into an instrument of the system where you advance its interests, and that's where the existential dilemma kicks in. Now, the thing is, what I find a little disappointing with the presentation, especially the initial stage, was that they're quite predictable and monotonous, because this question about David Goldblatt, I mean, like, he's just an example of what is in South Africa, and I'm not too sure if we should continue to ask those kind of questions, especially where we are. And the thing is, it's a reiteration. We are all working within this system that I've described, and we are all condemned to make the best of it, right? Now, I'm saying so because, you see, you have to compromise yourself to get ahead somehow, and if you don't, you are marginalized or ultimately eradicated, as I was. You know, I'm not saying that I'm the example of a radical militant black journalist and what have you. Now, what's happened to David Goldblatt is what happens to black journalists and photographers who work in the system. So there's nothing special or unique about it. The man had to make choices, and if you work for Anglo, even up to this day, if you work for Anglo, you get paid well and you live very well. It doesn't matter whether you're black or white, and that's the nature of the system. Now, the thing is, you can think of a man who is considered to be the founding father of so-called black journalism, John Tenqu Jabavu, and if you research him, you realize that no, the man is even projected as such because he sided with the system, right? He sided with the system, and he's this icon and legend today. Now, I want to conclude by saying, I think one of my major concerns is this thread of victimization when you are black. You know, we've got to begin to admit that we've got to make these choices as photographers, as artists, and we've got to live with the consequences of what we choose at that time. Because talking about apartheid and colonialism without denying it, it does not change it. Now, this is the 40th anniversary of Steve Biko, right? And there were initiatives that they started in the 60s and the 70s. The question is, what happened to them? And we do need a paradigm shift where we admit that no, we are human beings condemned to make very difficult choices. The issue of human agency needs to come in. I've attended, for instance, funerals of black photographers and journalists. They've got this work, but I'm not too sure whether the family or the community cares. It's there. Maybe it's a significant development that we have in young black guys who are coming in and they're looking into this. You are right in doing the right thing about Usantu, who has got a heritage of work. Whose responsibility is it to capture that and elevate it? And the whole thing of human agency and taking responsibility, for me, is the way to go, because if we continue this way like we're in 1968 or 77, I'm sorry, we're not moving in the right direction. We have a choice to look at ourselves through our own eyes, or continue to complain and look at what whites are doing, and we sit and we cite people who are white, and they have every right to do that, because they too, like everyone else, have a right to look into whatever that they want to look into. And it's not like, I may come across as an apologist. It's not like, and I'm talking this way because I've spoken to them, it's not like some of them have got all the resources. They're just ordinary folks like everybody, and you've got to choose what you have to do. Thank you.
Okay, okay. It's not like I'm not recognizing the other hands, but let's have a quick set of responses. For me personally, I'd like to try and deal with the Sandile Mamela issues that he has brought up, and then also the issue of the aesthetic that Tembatsotsi brought up.
I just want to say that for me, what I struggle with is the way in which art has somehow captured photography. Photography is not just art. And it seems like everywhere I go, I'm having to be around a conversation where photography is considered as art. And so the question that you asked was completely framed within art language. Photography was also state and religious practice. It was also it's science. The so-called STEM industries rely on photography. So I think we need to expand, please, the way in which we're talking about photography, because it's not just art. And the second comment I'll make with Mr. Malela, I think you're right. And I'm going to refer back to this archive and democracy thing that I was at recently, because that was the other kind of frustration that I had, because we were so concerned, and even the premise of this discussion is based on the fact that we need to retrieve material from wherever and bring it into our possession. That is a beginning. It's not the end. Because in that conversation around archives, when I asked the organizer, so okay, our history didn't just start in apartheid, what are we doing? For example, if we're interested in this issue about land reform, we still need to be talking about the missionaries, right? For example, so he was saying, no, we're just interested in this 1970s, 1980s classified documents. That's what we want to free. The colonial archive, we already have access to that. So for me, I was like, what? We already have access to this. So what have we been doing with what we already know? So I think, Ms. Elena, what you're saying is this conversation that we're having. It's not an end. It's a beginning. And I want to perhaps ask some hard questions. What in the last 20 years have we been doing with the stuff that we already know?
And I think with the archive about Santu, what is interesting is that how Santu gets in photography, like how he works during apartheid. He works as a lab assistant for a newspaper. So all of the photographers, the white photographers, were going into the township and photographing. Santu then starts processing it for it to be published. What is interesting, Wuti, he is one of those people who then photographed the everyday, right? Because a lot of the photographs we know of apartheid are the struggle images. Yes, the work is about struggle, yet he looks at it in another way, right? It's not direct and brutal, you know. With regards to the archive, Yagabab Santu, is that we're talking about ownership, right? So, and it's actually what's the conversation right now. Santu does not own his images. His archive is lost. And it goes down to the conversations that we have with our families where they don't know what we do. And when Santu dies, nobody knows what happens to that archive. He's alive, nobody knows what's happening with that archive. So those are the bigger problems that we're facing. You know, it's communication with families, yes. Who takes care of the photo, my archive once I die? Who understands it? And that is a communication that we need to have with our own families, because I don't think there's any of us that want to end up in Santu's shoes. He can no longer speak for himself. So he has his wife who's doing that for him. Do Do you understand the frustration that he's probably going through, just wanting to say this, you know? And it's the contracts that we're signing. I keep on saying this to people. How does Santu not own his work? How is the shared copyright? In which world should I be sharing my images with someone else and us sharing the money? You know what I mean? So these are other things that we as photographers need to be talking about and being aware of. Lawyers exist. Before you're signing things, you have to have someone who has a legal background. So in Santu's case is quite a crazy one that needs to be sorted now.
I think the question I was most interested in was Kumbuzo's question around both visual artists, contemporary artists, and known photographers and how they've struggled to deal with the question of the custodianship of their work and the ownership of their work. And I think Akona began to make that point, and I can't sit here as the current trainer of professional practice in the advanced program here at Photo Workshop and not tackle that question from that very sort of direct experiential standpoint, which is to say that the question of shared copyright, I think it begins within the school itself. Do students know that they share copyright here in terms of the work that they produce over the years as students? Do they know how to retrieve full copyright? These are very real and pointed questions I'm posing. Same with entering into representation of the gallery. Are you so intimidated by the white owner of a gallery when he presents a contract to you, so intimidated that you're not willing to take that contract to a lawyer and read it through thoroughly? Like, there needs to be a much more emboldened effort amongst us as individual artists and whatnot to sort of do the thing that must make the positive happen now when it comes to ownership and copyright, and not, because the frustration that the Mamela states about like what is the next step, what are we doing, and again what Candice emphasizes with what we know, what are we doing? I mean, we know there's an open question now in terms of a peer of ours who passed away, Thabiso Sekgala. It's a red hot button question, and the people who can answer those questions are not coming to us to tell us what is happening with Thabiso. There are rumors that the family is yet to build a trust in order to take full ownership of his archive. These things are controversial and they're very difficult to talk about, and you will offend, but we must talk about them. A historical example of how archives of specifically photographers who gain massive reputations globally, whose work is seminal, Seydou Keita in Mali. I think Akona, you know better about this, but essentially what happened was that the family was fooled into handing over his entire archive to a French art dealer. So these things infuriate me intensely. And I think it has to do with the way in which we move forward with our educational curriculums and how we speak about these things directly and openly, not just amongst ourselves and not just about dealing with our own frustrations, but to the powers that be.
Let me now weigh in on, I'll start with Tembatsot. I have a notion which may be wrong. It feels wrong, but having worked at the Hector Peterson Museum now for 7 years, I'm becoming more and more convinced that it is true. And that is, everything becomes art eventually. And there are, the first person who brought this to my attention actually is Peter McKenzie. And I forget the photographer, but this person documented child labor in New York around the turn of the 20th century. And looking at these images, I mean, at the time they were shocking, right? But looking at them now, they look like really beautiful images. I do not see the pain and the suffering that is implied in the images. Looking at 12-year-old boys and 9-year-olds next to these machines, because these machines were huge, and the little boys were, small enough to get into the crevices of those machines and, change things and all of that kind of stuff. So, I mean, the social context of those images is harrowing, but the images themselves are beautiful. So there's a kind of contradiction there, but I think that's what time does to images. Okay? That's the one. And then in response to, I'm deeply disturbed. Because I think, actually no, I'm not deeply disturbed. But it just, your comments make me actually think about how the focus on apartheid, and in particular the brutal ways in which apartheid applied itself, makes violence seem like a, because you mentioned that the photographers like Goldblatt, they were just doing their job basically. And that is not true. There is something about the violence of white supremacy that is not just towards a particular end. So slavery is not just about the fact that the labor was for free. That's not it. There is also something, and this is Frank Wilderson's point around, especially now the Black Lives Matter issue that's cropping up, or what they call the new Jim Crow. And that is, white violence is libidinal. It has nothing, or it has very little to do with the ends to which the violence is utilized. And so, when we think about apartheid, we should also think about the libidinal aspects of apartheid, not the exploitative aspect of it, not just the exploitative side of it. Hence, to say that we are implicated does not mean that we are complicit, and it does not mean that we are perpetrators as well. There is a clear division in my mind between perpetrator, collaborator, and victim. Okay, so we cannot fudge the boundaries between those categories. And so, yes, the issue of personal responsibility is important, but also one needs to look at the deeper systemic issues so that one can take an informed but also a principled position on where you stand. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, Nana, Nosipo, and there is a hand up there, and the men with the sporty and Delel. Okay, in that order, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do not come from an art background. I'm not an artist, but what I hear at this symposium is very disturbing for me. Number one, I think what I hear is that there are problems, okay? When you speak of David Goldblatt, I think there's a schizophrenic existence wherein he contributes to this institution here, and yet he has the guts to move some of his works to Yale, all right? I hear a number of problems, what you cited, in that you were, you were tasked with a responsibility, but then, and correct me if I'm wrong, but then there were people who didn't really trust what you were doing and saw that it was necessary to edit some of the work that you did. So I work in a different industry, and I'm very ignorant to what is happening. But I want to say, art for me is about capturing our history, wherever it comes from, wherever it is. And therefore, I think we're entering a different era in our struggle as Black people. And my question to you is, I hear all these complaints and I hear this, that, and I am very worried in terms of what is the artist's social responsibility in terms of all these things that are happening. Because in as much as some of us are scientists and we do some work in science, but the amount of work and the responsibility that you have towards our kids, towards the other generation is much more than us as yes, I can go to Mars tomorrow and whatever. And yes, maybe that is important. But in terms of, one, black emancipation, because there's no other way black people are ever going to be able to be proud of themselves until such time that these things that you're talking about are depicted in a responsible manner. Are black people ever going to be as proud as they're supposed to be? We're never going to speak of black consciousness the way that we're supposed to speak. Because what you're talking about is about bringing that pride in the black person. So, if you're an artist, what is it? How are you going to collectively sort out these problems? Yes, you speak of problems, yes, you speak of this, yes, you speak of that, and there are numerous problems and they're difficult. And are you going to take the responsibility of taking a stand collectively? Don't ever think that when you are in such a problem, it is just going to be you going to sign that contract or doing whatever, or the work that I take on, and what. How are you collectively going to take what you are talking about today and take it out to the world so that you fight that struggle differently? I'm in a science world, I fight my struggle differently. So I'm challenging you, what is the problem? Ask yourselves until you get to the bottom of the problem, and then how do we correct it collectively? So I want to know, as people who are depicting our history, what are you going to do about it? Yes, I hear all the problems that you're talking about.
Nasipo, okay, Nasipo first, and then across to the lady over there.
Hello, Nasipo Bopela. Just want to first state that this is the one sector of arts that I am an infantile in. I'm very, very green. So my first question is probably going to take a lot of you back, and I'm sorry if it's a little childlike. I need to just understand, you brought up the issue of a certain photographer, so I didn't get the name down. Ernest Cole, where he was being defined as an illustrator. And I immediately went, okay, so what is the difference in the function of a photographer between a documenter and an illustrator and an artist? Then the other thing that I had more of an opinion on, or a comment on, than a question, was the David Goldblatt situation. I read briefly about it, and it reminded me of an artist, a director and scriptwriter called Brett Bailey, who had the huge controversial space with Exhibit A and how it was rejected in South Africa but consumed lustfully and ran long in Europe. And I go, well, are we surprised that Europe is willing to keep and willing to protect a perspective of our history that is from their view, and it's what they see out of it and how they want to sell black people, especially within that context of apartheid. Maybe it is a good thing that it goes there. Let them keep their history and open up the room, the galleries, for us to put our perspective of it and our view and our images of what we took out of apartheid, whether it's violence, whether it's sad, whether it's encouraging in the sense of like the Steve Biko's and the people that got you up and fighting and willing to lay your life on the line, or wish you were born in a space where you could have done those things. But yeah, primarily I'd love to know the difference between documenter, illustrator, and artist.
Hi, my name is Nyembezi Piri, and I come from I have a background in advertising. It's just a background now, fortunately. So I'm also with one leg within the education space of visual communication, to be specific. So photography plays a very vital, well, a very key role. Now, I realize, okay, I have 2 questions. I don't know if they're questions, I just want to see where it goes. The first aspect is subjects in photography. So I've had the privilege of having access to, society in Accra, society in Lilongwe, and society in Nairobi, and watching photography, because those are very attractive destinations for especially the outside world coming in. Now, what I see is that the African public doesn't seem to be protected in terms of where the work goes. A lot of the photographers come with permits that have already been granted to them before they arrived on the African continent, that give them unlimited access to people's lives, people's private spaces. People are captured mourning. People are captured at their most vulnerable state, where they don't even realize that. So I'm just interested in if anyone has something to say in response to that. Also, to add to that, you find that the black photographer does not have the same, that is not received the same way within the African continent. I was in Accra, I'm still in Accra between last year and this year, and the challenge is you cannot do what a white photographer can do. Those of you who have traveled within the African continent have seen you can't do what a white photographer does until 2017. It's the most painful thing. You pay for what other people get for free, simply because of your story. The second thing that I'm interested in as well, I realize we've been talking a lot about documentary type of photography. So from the perspective of being an African in terms of commercial work, when I say commercial work, I'm specifically meaning photography, whether it's fashion photography or whether it's photography in terms of, personal photography. So it's obviously a way of storytelling as well. And what happens is, because it is introduced to the young African as art, there are certain principles one must abide to, certain ways of seeing that one must first understand before they can discover their own. And often that is like a secondary role that you realize when you're now creatively impotent. I don't know if I'm making any sense. I'm just speaking from a sense of feeling. So I would like to hear those of you who are in education, within the education space, how, the role of a photographer from choosing the subject. I mean, let me just give an example maybe to elaborate what seems to be a lack of words. We had a composition class at the school where I work in Accra. We had a composition class where, just as an experiment, I brought in a thin model and, a healthy woman. And just to see what will happen to the students, what they will do. And of course, what seemed to happen is that all the students shot the thin girl, the slim girl, and for, I think it was a 2-hour session, for about 2/3 of the time. And it was only after they ran out of freshness within their subjects that most of them actually went to the other girl to photograph. So now, even in terms of editing, there are certain ideas that happen in how we edit, the way Photoshop has been built. Those of you who've had to work in Photoshop, the way filters have been built, are all not obviously designed for black skin. So what eventually happens is, from an editing perspective as well, there's another story, another current that's happening at the same time. In choosing who should be in a photo, who should be at the forefront, who should be on a cover, it's all driven from my professional background, from a commercial perspective, because we would get a brief, and the brief would say the target audience is, the housewives who ideally live in Soweto, with one TV set earning between this much and this much, and what's happening is we need to speak to them. So photographically speaking, before the photograph is even born, you have to think about how to psychologically capture, at least speak to that woman in terms of her aspiration, of which you'd have to build the aspiration based on whatever the product is. So I'm really interested in also those type of conversations where we also touching on that aspect of photography, where it's shaping the everyday. If you go outside, there's billboards, there's posters, there's Instagram, there's Facebook, there's selfies. There is all these things that are at the same time part of this story. And the only way the public understands, or at least a beginner photographer understands what archiving would be in their context, would be getting published. And I think I'll stop there for now. I think I've sparked something, I hope.
The guy in the stretcher hat.
Yo, mic check, yeah. Thank you. Not a rapper, sorry. Just an artist. Okay, cool. This is very straightforward and straight to the point, and it's going for my homegirl Akona and some of the guys on the panel. I really want to get your perception and your understanding on the norms and standards of archiving. So here's an example, a synopsis. So basically putting your work out there on these different facets or different places that your work is going to. So does that make it a tangible way of keeping your work or creating an invisible, visible archive? Okay, if that makes sense. And then my second basically is where these works are going to, and basically you having, now that we're living in the digital era, having Sky drives and emailing your clients and friends images and stuff like that. Does this then make the people who are receiving your content, your images, does this then make them themselves archivists in a way, in a sense? Thank you very much. I ended there. Boom, boom, yeah.
Up there. And we'll end with Buyapi actually.
Yeah. In my real imagination, I'm thinking now, what put the final coffin in, what mainly caused Thomas Sankara's death, I believe, was in persistent insistence on taking important state meetings into the public areas. My point is that God forbid, that 30 years down the line, 50 years down the line, there will be a group of artists or people associated with art sitting almost all by themselves talking about almost the same topic that we're dealing with now. You know. So then comes the question is that, how is it possible that some of these questions that we're talking about today, yesterday, and any other day, part of the problem is that there is, again, this persistent disconnect between us and the rest of our communities. From little things, you know, a particular example is one of yesterday. People out there believe, think, continue to call their photographers cameramen. Sorry that I have to go back. This is just an example. They continue to do so. We're in a different space. We decide, and rightfully so, because we educated enough to understand that there is offensiveness to this way, because it excludes. But what does it help when we deal with this word all by ourselves? How do we connect our understanding of this word back to the greater society? You know, so that's my example, that if in future we're dealing with these questions, can we try and connect the societies, because they're part, given our history, there's so much, if we almost have to start afresh at many levels. Our history is one of denial, cruelty, and there is no excuse about that. In the same way, there's no excuse about white supremacy. It's dangerous, it has ravaged this country. We can't begin to create justification whatsoever. But I think, personally, I believe that we are missing the point when we don't make enough attempt to reconnect with the greater society.
Okay, thank you. I will try to say something, and then I'll pass on the mic to my panelists. Okay, first starting with Nana Kule. Part of the reason why we formed our collective Black Mark, initially it was a study group. So, and I was saying to Mr. Memela during the group, during the lunch break, that how I experienced the academy, and I don't want to locate the problem only within the academy, because I have witnessed also in cultural spaces around Soweto how there seems to have been a break between the generation of practitioners from the 70s and 80s and the generation that followed. Because in a sense, people now have to be told who Wale Soweto is. Okay. It could be because of exile, it could have been because of the cultural boycott, I don't know. It could be a number of reasons. But also, and Lefeto, I went to the same institution as Lefeto. I did not know about, for instance, we were not taught about David Golwane. I discovered the journal third text by accident when I was wandering in the library on my own. I discovered I Write What I Like by accident when I was wandering in the library on my own. I discovered Fanon by accident when I was wandering in the library on my own. And it's not that, it's not just that it was deliberately withheld from us, but because of also of the incompetence of the people who taught us. So, for us as Black Mark, it was important for us to document not just what people are producing as art or as photography in the now, but also the ideas that surround their practice. Because the other probability and the other possibility is that if we do not do this, we will complain when Patricia Hayes writes about us. So we have to do that work ourselves. So that's part, even though it seems like we're complaining, it's also part of the solution. I don't know if that makes sense. And I hope that in some ways I've dealt with both Nana Kule and Buyapi's issue. The other thing is, and I get your point, I take nothing away from your point whatsoever, Buyapi. But also at the same time, I don't think that we can make a binary between, a false binary between the people and us. Okay. Yes, there is a certain degree to which we have access to certain languages and certain discourses, but I think at the same time, it's not as though there aren't, in whatever space we imagine the people to be, there aren't discourses being produced there, and that there isn't a constant dialogue between the two spaces. I can say that basically based on my personal experience working in Soweto. I don't know if it's true of every context, but I am certainly becoming more aware that there is this kind of constant dialogue, and basically also part of, I think maybe Sumangaliso Sibia, who's here, who is a graduate of Funda Center, can attest to this, in the sense that we have collaborated, the museum and Funda Center, many times. And so I don't see that there is, that distinction is really that clear to me. I think that, yes, there is a degree to which we need to make more of an effort to do that. But at the same time, I don't think that we are also somehow removed from the society in which we exist.
Okay. I think I'm going to try and tie Biapi's question to Nosipo. Have you guys seen this new publication, Commonplace, that was published by Fourth Wall Books? So this book brings together because for me, Biapi, what you're saying, I think within this photographic conversation, we need to talk more about family photography. Because I think family photography is really, for me, a kind of a bridge between these issues. Because our archives are sitting in our homes. So family photography, I think, is quite a critical, of political concern for the Visual Archive. And I'm talking about this Commonplace book because it basically brings together this family archive of this kind of early 20th century white family who has a farm somewhere in KZN. And it brings that archive together with Ronald Glima's work. And if you look at how that book is constructed, there's no text there. And basically what they do is they use the photographs as illustration. So they put together on the one side pictures of a white family, and she might be wearing a nice dress, and then they'll put a Ronald picture there with a black lady in a nice dress. To kind of, I don't know what they're trying to do with that, but they're using it as illustration. So in the example with Ernest Cole, his photographs, yes, on one level, they show us what apartheid looked like in Johannesburg. But illustration is not enough because they're not actually telling us the ways in which, because thinking about just that his photograph was just about apartheid, it wasn't just about that. He was working biographically, he was working with his own life story. And he obviously took incredible personal risk, not just in his mortality of dying, but he actually gave up his identity in order to create that work, which we don't necessarily see in images if they don't tell us about that, because they're just using it as, hey, this is what a whites only space looked like in Johannesburg. So please guys, find that book Commonplace. It's actually giving me a few sleepless nights. I don't quite know what to make of it. What they're doing with those two family archives and bringing them together completely, again, uses it as illustration and doesn't actually address the history of those two spaces. Like, what does it mean to see a family in Benoni photographed outside their house versus this like white tea party group photo that they're putting next to each other? Like, complete illustration of what? I don't know.
Sorry, I have to chime in there, because this is, for me, another interesting thing about how the work, for instance, if you look at, there was an exhibition here which was called Picasso in Africa, where they brought Picasso's artworks and showed the masks, which are supposedly the inspiration behind Picasso's work. Again, that is illustration, because the only reason why the masks are there is to illustrate Picasso. It's not, for the aesthetic qualities of the masks themselves. Similarly, this has been something that has been worrying me about Santo Mofokeng's the way in which Thato Mogotsi's work has been sometimes talked about as a counter narrative to David Goldblatt. So if people talk, for instance, Duncan Cronin's work, to say, oh, if Duncan Cronin produced this kind of work, there's a counterpoint, which is Thato Mogotsi's Black Photo album. If David Goldblatt produced this kind of work about the transported of Gwandebele, this is Thato Mogotsi's counter-narrative of Chasing Shadows or whatever other photo essay that. So this kind of always thinking like of saying it's happening throughout the literary world. In addition to that, oh, we also have our own Dickens, we also have our own Shakespeare, and so forth and so on. So that kind of thinking just has to go. Yeah.
I think I'd like Marcus to say this question again, because I got lost in the mic checks and all of that. So please help.
No.
Yo.
No. Okay, look, all right, we got the question. So something about the norms and standards of archiving, and when people share these images, are they not archivists themselves?
It is there to inform, right? It's the physicality, right? But what happens to the physicality of it after that, there's no control of it.
Okay, so let me try to answer your question in a different way. Currently, there's a move towards digitization of archives, right? So, but servers can be hacked, files can be corrupted, many of things. So it's not as though by simply archiving or digitizing a physical archive that you have solved the problem. I've heard that actually CDs are the safest, but CDs also require certain controlled conditions, temperature and humidity controls. There are certain molds that have evolved to eat up CDs. Believe it or not, there are molds that are specifically self-designed to eat up CDs. And these are things, so there is something that I hate bringing up these people, but anyway, Derrida talks about this thing called the death drive in the archive, that somehow there is always a danger of the archive being lost. So there isn't a kind of magic pill that can absolutely guarantee either the authenticity or the integrity or the physical veracity of the thing. We are always in that kind of space of it being in danger. Okay, I'll end there. No? No, okay.
All right. So I think Omreka is touching into something that I've been sort of wrestling in my mind ever since I came across a text by Hito Steyal, which I've been punting to my students, to everyone. I've just been thinking through this question, this proposal that she makes in her text in defense of the poor image. I think we're heading towards we are in a world of poor images. And I also want to so she defines the poor image as a copy of a copy, a fifth generation, a remix, and an image without with an obscure genealogy. You know, the image that cannot be contained, an image that exists and is a part of our reality. We consume it in many different ways and forms, share it in many different ways and forms, and that's directly related to online culture and the digital age. And then I want to relate that to, sorry, I think your last name was Zapirine, when you were talking about the relationship between, subject in photography, and how images that are not necessarily authored by ourselves, as people of this place, you know, the continent of Africa, as oftentimes historically and currently remaining the subjects within the representations and narratives of others, of those who are not of this place, those who are in the north, in the western realm, who come with a particular kind of privilege. I feel like we need to be inherently dismissive of what we can't help but consume within popular culture and media, because that would be, for me, inherently that popular culture and media we consume is informed by Western tropes and conversations and stereotypes, and in that sense we need to sort of begin a new conversation around our own visual literacy, I think. That turns the interrogation onto ourselves. How are we seeing and consuming the images that we're living with, that we're forcibly and, you know, can't help but be surrounded by, right, by the very nature of things, right, and the certain class economies of images that exist in our world. We need to, in doing so, in creating a new conversation around what kind of visual literacy we are actually working with here, I think we begin to then unpack the value system we place on images, on the photograph as this material thing that has to be sharp and perfectly framed and shiny and glossy and at a large, massive scale and framed and hung on a wall and so on and so forth. I think then we begin to create, you know, a shift in the canonization of photography itself, I think, as a medium in the world that we live in, and as a language, the way in which particular images are canonized in commercial practice, or, you know, and so on and so forth. Certain aesthetics are emphasized above others or foregrounded above others. I think it becomes a more complicated engagement with the way we consume and interact and engage and make images. Yeah.
Okay, thank you all for coming. This is the end of the session. But as a parting shot, let me just say this. And I'm paying homage now to Umrepa over there, because I'm about to reference Ice Cube. And he was in an interview with a US TV host called Bill Maher. And Bill Maher was basically saying something like, oh, we've heard these complaints about Black Lives Matter over and over again. And basically, Ice Cube said, but you haven't heard it from me. So, however many times it deserves to be said, that's how many times we will say it. Yeah. Sharp, sharp. Hello. Can I please thank the panelists? I know I gave them a very hard time because they kept saying, what do we need to prepare? What do we need to prepare? And I was saying, no, but you know, just do the readings and we'll let the conversation flow. So thank you for allowing this process to unfold. Thank you. Thank you.